Good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this informative seminar. I am Sabrina Clark, the chapter president of Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Our Economic Development Committee is excited to offer the communities that we serve this wonderful opportunity to learn more about closing the racial wealth gap in Metro Atlanta. It's no secret that many minority and Black families in our service area are not wealthy. Many don't know where to start to make changes with their finances, but tonight, we are all here to receive good information on how to decrease the wealth gap for our families. We're very glad to have you here this evening, and we hope you will leave this webinar ready to make a financial wealth difference. I will now pass the baton to Soror Catrice Spicer.
Thank you, Soror Clark. Before we begin tonight, we just have a few simple housekeeping items to remind you of. You've entered an area where photography, audio, and video recording will occur, and by entering the event premises, you consent to such recording, media, and its release, publication, exhibition, or reproduction. We'd also like to remind you that attendee microphones are muted, and this is to eliminate background noise for others. And we look forward to your comments and questions in the Zoom chat. We will answer as many of these questions as we can during our allotted time for Q&A after the presentation. We are so happy to have Mrs. Latresa McLaughlin Ryan join us this evening as our speaker. Mrs. Ryan is the Executive Director of the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, AWBI, which is a data center nonprofit dedicated to closing the racial wealth gap. Under her leadership, AWBI launched its signature Advancing Enterprise Prosperity, 1,000 Black businesses in 1,000 days initiative to empower businesses with the assets and tools to hire at least one person per day and pay them a living wage. Prior to joining AWBI, Latresa held leadership roles at SunTrust Bank, where she was vice president within the Foundations and Endowments specialty practice, and also at Operation Hope, where she served as the Director of Office of Partnerships and Global Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Development. As a graduate of Spelman College and the University of North Carolina School of Law, Mrs. Ryan began her career as an attorney in Washington, D.C., and started her own boutique law firm there. Having a deep personal commitment to strengthening communities, Latresa serves as board member and former chair of the Grove Park Foundation, a board member for the Georgia Planned Giving Council, Center for Civic Innovation, and Georgia Social Impact Collaborative. She is also a member of the United Way of Greater Atlanta Community Engagement Council, the Greenlight Fund Advisory Council, the Emory University Board of Visitors, and the Children's School Board of Trustees. Please join me now in welcoming Mrs. Latresa McLaughlin Ryan. Additionally, please do feel free, again, to add your questions to the Zoom chat, and we will try to make sure that all of these questions are answered. Mrs. Ryan.
Thank you so much, Catrice. It's a pleasure being here with you all today. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure being with you. I'm honored to share a bit of information and context setting about the racial wealth gap, as well as the steps my organization is taking to address racial wealth inequity, along with collectively working together throughout the ecosystem to address these issues. So as we all work together as individuals, families, communities, and businesses to explore expanding and developing strategies, I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. So a little bit of information about the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. We are a community-built, data-driven, intermediary nonprofit organization focused on closing the racial wealth gap at the systems level through community wealth building strategies. We serve as an umbrella organization and hub, if you will, in the ecosystem as a think tank, community convener, funder, philanthropic, and community development advisor, data engine, and student impact fund. We found as we engage with and advise other communities across the country that pulling all these components together under one organization squarely focused on closing the racial wealth gap is an essential component to ensure the issues are addressed fully and holistically. We move our work forward by leveraging national and international best practices and bold ideas, sharing those ideas broadly, but specifically with our community practice, which is about 50 nonprofit, government, quasi-government, and philanthropic organizations, which keeps our work grounded in the community's needs for maximum impact. We also focus on addressing the systemic barriers to capital through nonprofit capacity building grants and grants for innovative prototypes, flexible grants and loans to Black-owned businesses, as well as as well as helping funders and capital providers maximize the impact, and in some cases, reimagine how they deploy capital to the community, all with the goal to increase shared prosperity throughout Atlanta. Ideas, capital, and people are at the core of our organization to create an Atlanta where shared prosperity is a reality for all. So the good news is Atlanta is thriving. It has a thriving, bustling economy. We are home to 30 Fortune 500 and 1,000 companies, which had $438 billion in aggregated revenues in 2019. We have a strong network of post-secondary and education institutions, and our culture, energy, and dedication to this great city is unmatched. However, Atlanta is currently a number 2 in income inequality, just behind San Juan, Puerto Rico, and we are near the bottom of the list for economic mobility. A child born into poverty in Atlanta has just a 4% chance of escaping it in his or her lifetime. For Atlanta Black-owned businesses, the average business value is $58,000 compared to $658,000 for a white-owned business, which makes them valued 11 times more than Black-owned businesses. Additionally, currently, 96% of Black-owned businesses in Atlanta are sole proprietorships. The median Black household income in Atlanta is $28,000 compared to roughly $84,000 for white households. This compares to the median national Black household income at $36,000 compared to $60,000 nationally for white households. To state it more clearly, if you are a white person in Atlanta, you are thriving well beyond most households nationally, but Black households are living below the national mark. As we gather here today to discuss closing the racial wealth gap, I'd like to share a bit of information about wealth in America, what it is, where we are, how we got here, and what we can do collectively to address the great disparities that exist. As I share my remarks, you will begin to see a common thread demonstrating the greatest disparities across the board, be it health, income, wealth, education, housing, or the criminal justice system, all exist between and have the greatest impact on African Americans. To illustrate what this means, I'd like to share a metaphor originated by Bayard Love and Dina Haynes Green of the Racial Equity Institute in their report, The Groundwater Approach, Building Practical Understanding of Structural Racism, which assesses the state of the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. If you have a lake in front of your house and one fish is floating belly up dead, it makes sense to analyze the fish. What's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is the first question you would ask. Imagine the fish is one student failing in the education system. We'd ask, did it study hard enough? Is it getting the support it needs at home? But if you come out to the same lake and half the fish are floating belly up dead, what should you do? This time you got to analyze the lake. Imagine the lake is the education system and half the students are failing. This time we'd ask, might the system itself be causing such consistent, unacceptable outcomes for our students? If so, how? Now picture 5 lakes around your house. In each and every lake, half the fish are floating belly up dead. What is it time to do? It's time to analyze the groundwater. How did the water in all of these lakes end up with the same contamination? On the surface, the lakes don't appear to be connected, but it's possible, even likely, that they are. This time, we can imagine half the kids in a given region are failing in the education system. Half the kids suffer from ill health. Half are performing poorly in the criminal justice system. Half are struggling in and out of the child welfare system. And it's often the same kids in each system. If each system is creating similar inequities, similar disparities, we must assess how our systems are connected, how we use our positions in one system to impact a structural racial arrangement that is deeper than any one system. We cannot simply fix fish and clean up one lake at a time. All we do is put fixed fish back into toxic water or filter a lake that is quickly recontaminated by the toxic groundwater. This example and the inequity shared this evening indicate we live in a racially structural society, and that is what causes racial inequity. Racial inequity looks the same across the systems, regardless of people's culture or behavior, and regardless of socioeconomic differences. These inequities affect African Americans disproportionately. Accordingly, I'm going to focus on that fact this evening. So to dive a little bit deeper into these systems, African Americans are 2.3 times more likely to experience infant death, 1.5 times more likely to be below proficient in reading in the 4th grade, 2.7 times more likely to be searched on a traffic stop, and African Americans are 5.2 times more likely to be denied a loan. The likelihood of bad outcomes are consistent across the board. So to explore how we can address closing the racial wealth gap in particular, I like to begin, before diving deeper, with defining what we mean by wealth. Wealth from an economics perspective is one's net worth, the value of your assets minus the value of your debts, what you owe versus what you own. It's not defined by income or earnings. It provides economic security to take risks and shields against loss. It allows one to withstand financial hardship due to a personal or family emergency. But also, financial assets are essential to individual well-being and the viability of families and communities. The acquisition of wealth also has a profound impact across generations. It affords opportunity to purchase appreciating assets, which in turn generates wealth that can be accumulated and then passed down to children, thus begetting more wealth and opportunity. Families and communities without wealth, particularly intergenerational wealth and accumulated assets, are at a crucial disadvantage in their everyday life and in their ability to participate in our democracy. Wealth, however, is more than financial assets. Critical to the accumulation and sustainability of wealth is power and agency, a sense of control over one's life and destiny, the ability to make choices and craft a future for yourself, your family, and your community. Wealth is comprised of other types of capital, including the social capital of connection, the individual capital of skills, the intellectual capital of new ways of operating, and the natural capital of healthy ecosystems. Power and wealth accumulation come from capital of various types, as well as the ownership of assets. Wealth provides options for essential childcare, to more freely navigate systems to attain both private education or options to live in better public school districts, safe and secure housing with better amenities, the ability to finance a business, access quality healthcare, life-saving medical procedures. It also affords the ability to purchase better legal counsel to protect one's interests in a civil matter or within an expensive criminal justice system. Currently, the net worth of a typical white family nationally is $171,000 compared to $17,000 for a Black family. This includes housing equity, a factor of 10 times more than Black families. Said another way, for every $1 a white family has, a Black family has 10 cents. Even during times of economic growth, inequality grows, with all gains going to the elite and upper middle class. In the midst of these striking inequities, narratives persist, attributing the gap to center on the notion that, for example, Black people are not as eager to acquire education, which then inhibits their ability to acquire wealth. But the net worth of of Black people with a college degree is 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household with a high school diploma. While education is valuable, particularly with a cradle to career framework, education alone is not an antidote. Other narratives attribute the gap to behavior choices of how and where Black people spend their money. These narratives, however, do not address the root causes in the groundwater that result in continued disparity. By attributing these inequities to individual personal deficits and behavior, it ignores the advantages of wealth and the pervasive historical and structural policies that have contributed to the intrinsic privileges that favor those with existing wealth rather than systems to establish new wealth. Ignoring the history and policy is a choice that also prevents action to assess structural solutions. As James Baldwin stated, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The historical conditions of building wealth in this country are largely grounded by the labor and land holdings of Black and brown people. Slavery was the most profound economic engine for the foundation and continued progress of our economy. Institutions, endowments, and individuals benefit to this day from contributions of slave labor and predatory practices that have impacted the descendants of enslaved people. In addition to the limitations of slavery, attempts of formerly enslaved and freed Black Americans to garner wealth were largely followed by violence, seizure, and the appropriation of land and resources from the end of the 19th century through the early 20th century. The Homestead Act, for example, was established to provide 160 acres of public land, which forced Indigenous Americans from land they held for centuries to provide an economic mobility engine for largely white Americans. Freed slaves technically qualified, but the act specifically excluded two occupations: agricultural workers and domestic servants, largely preventing freed Black Americans from using this tool of social welfare to establish economic security and wealth. 45 million people still benefit from this program. This was followed by the failure to provide 40 acres promised after the end of the Civil War. This period was closely followed by white-led massacres beginning during Reconstruction that impacted vast amounts of wealth accumulated during this period, particularly by Black property owners, and especially in communities of Black prosperity. This includes better-known events such as in the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 and Rosewood, Florida in 1923, but also in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, which started as a result of sharecroppers attempting to organize a union. This intimidation and terror has had a lasting impact for generations, causing some Black people to not dare assert their equality or autonomy. There is an expectation of disenfranchisement at best and violence at worst. Less obvious than sheer violence are policies that constructed highways intentionally through Black neighborhoods like the Haytide District in Durham, or the intentional construction of I-20 in Atlanta that still leaves the city largely segregated. Similar to the Homestead Act, other public policies during the Jim Crow era after World War II, such as the GI Bill and federal subsidy programs to assist people to become homeowners, which intended to create greater social and economic mobility for Americans, also ultimately excluded Black Americans. Due to the decentralized administration of these policies, where local administrators made the decisions regarding which veterans received benefits, these benefits were vastly not available to Black veterans and overutilized by white people. These policies and the lack of access to these programs widen the wealth gap and continue with practices such as redlining, which persists informally today. So effective action is required to, So effective action will be required or requires a system of support and changes to existing systems to adequately address the wealth disparities that exist, including shifting tax policies, advocacy, and efforts to build civic, cultural, and political agency, focusing on stable long-term investments to maximize impact on structures and systems of power. However, neither philanthropy, nonprofits, or government can do it alone. The system of support requires all of us to engage. And so excited to be with you all tonight to share information. And I'm very excited that also that you all were moved to raise awareness around this issue. We can lead transformative work and serve as a guide to tackle systemic barriers and the structural issues within our groundwater to promote equity for the most marginalized residents. As history has repeated, addressing the problem for the marginalized provides positive, measurable impact for the general populace as well. Accordingly, Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative's data-led focus employs and promotes 7 main strategies of community wealth building. These strategies are centered, my apologies. These strategies are centered on community wealth building as groundwater solutions, modeling frameworks implemented nationally and internationally, such as those in Preston, United Kingdom. I often emphasize these strategies are not new or radical. There was a time when we were a community-centered economy, when we held a responsibility individually and as a society to the greater good and community's well-being before neoliberalism and free market capitalism took a hold as an intentional, well-funded, and carefully implemented strategy. Another good point to note is that according to a recent survey and report by Citi, if we address and include some of these strategies to actively close the racial wealth gap, we can, there's an additional $4.8 trillion that we can provide in GDP growth by 2025. So including these strategies and strategies overall to address the racial wealth gap not only makes sense for the Black community and for those who are living with these disparities every day, but it creates a stronger economy overall. Among these strategies that Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative implements, they include Anchor Collaborative and Procurement that directs resources of local institutions to improve and benefit their local neighborhoods and communities. It also includes financing policies. It also includes financing policies designed to build healthy local economies through equitable financial investments and access to low-cost capital and flexible terms and underwriting criteria. It includes equitable land and real estate strategies that focus on land trusts, urban gardens, and land banks to facilitate community ownership of land for affordable housing and affordable commercial space, as well as strategies to acquire blighted properties for future productive community use. These strategies also include enterprise development that includes small businesses, but also includes enterprise development and retention strategies ranging from efforts to promote entrepreneurship and small business development to worker-owned businesses and cooperatives. Workforce development is also a critical component to a strong community. And these strategies create pipelines for employment, linking employers, jobs, and training to residents and communities that have faced systemic barriers to sustainable employment opportunities. These strategies must be grounded in the lived experiences and realities many Black residents face daily. Our community wealth building strategies also include ecological resilience, which for us centers on environmental justice and centers on addressing some of the issues that our communities and residents are facing every day. So for example, currently a lot of our households along I-20 don't have the same barriers to both the noise and car pollution that are created and have been established in North Fulton. And that pollution not only impacts the health and wellness of the residents in those homes, but also impacts the property value of those homeowners. And those issues must be addressed to create, to provide the gap, but also to create an equitable opportunity to build and establish sustainable wealth. Finally, we have been implementing these strategies solely for the Black community. We have with this dedicated lens on Black people, we have chosen to add wellness, which focuses on addressing the impact structural racism and the disparities that have had on the physical and mental health of Black people. We found this lingering impact limits Black people's ability to innovate and explore the fullness of their abilities as they hold the burden, often subconsciously, that they will be limited in how far they may excel simply because they are Black. This is proven to be true regardless of individual success or socioeconomic status. We approach racial healing as a collective responsibility and commitment rather than an internal healing that must occur within people of color. AWBI seeks out restorative solutions that identify the root issues to counteract centuries of discrimination, violence, and predatory practices. There are also additional specific steps that can be taken that many of you, perhaps in your day-to-day roles and certainly in your civic engagement, may be able to employ. Among those is, again, having this convening tonight, raising awareness around the issues that have impacted our ability to grow wealth, but also really understanding the root causes, the history, the context that must be taken into consideration as we are developing and deploying racial wealth equity solutions. To do this, I often tell others, and again, demonstrated tonight, is first increasing proximity. National partners can provide national perspective, research, and experience that can be tailored to local context. At the same time, local experience informs a national understanding of trends and can identify peers across an issue or policy arena, building support and reducing isolation in what can be difficult work. This is where many of you come in. Your relationships in your local communities and regions are critical to getting to the root causes of these disparities in your community. This path to addressing wealth disparities is different even where there are overarching themes and trends that can be tracked regionally or nationally. In that same way, local elections shape local policy and impact. Local economic development, philanthropy, research, and prescriptive support to shift local systems is critical to shaping the outcomes for local residents, city to city, across the region. There's an opportunity, quite frankly, and from our perspective, the duty is promoting a shared vision of prosperity and economic inclusion. And that's where we begin, with the mindset of how do we build wealth in a way that doesn't just extract from community for individual gain, but has a responsibility to community overall. To that end, work that we all can do collectively is supporting groups led by people of color for the benefit of communities of color that have a demonstrated grounded response to the communities they serve. Proximity is critical, and your proximity and engagement in community, as well as organizations like AWBI and other nonprofits who really that are really engaged, makes a difference in determining what solutions should actually be lifted and supported. This support should expand beyond financial capital. help people who are not in the room gain access and voice and agency, extend our intellectual and social and reputational capital on behalf of these people. Listen to them and do not discount the effectiveness of their efforts because they are under-resourced. Black-led organizations are grossly underfunded, and the funding they receive is incredibly restricted, limiting their ability to be innovative and maximize effectiveness to tackle a deeply rooted problem. So I encourage us all to support either through our volunteer service or through our giving to ensure that our organizations that have the greatest impact in the community can continue to do their great work. Other solutions that we promote are centered around hiring Black people within organizations and giving them the opportunity to expand their insight and unique perspective across a body of work and not just for efforts that are focused on Black people or people of color. We also believe that collecting and analyzing demographic data is critical, evaluating who is supported, who is in leadership, who should be in leadership, who that investment is benefiting, and in creating important policies internally or assessing internal policies that create barriers. Where applicable, evaluate where giving is given, where we are investing in business and promoting the investment in business diversity. For example, part of our work is centered in partnership with Emory University's 9 colleges and 11 healthcare centers. And in doing that work, we are introducing procurement opportunities as a growth opportunity for Black-owned businesses, but procurement in a way that Black-owned businesses should be a part of the overall spend of an institution and not just part of a supplier diversity program, which tends to be a small percentage of overall spend. So important with that is to assess what types of businesses are being supported, expanding beyond those that might typically seem to be easier to reach, and ensuring that everything from who invests the capital to who's providing executive search services, other professional services, in addition to construction and catering and those sorts of services that are typically sought after for Black entrepreneurs when it comes to procurement opportunities. I will move on to just a little bit of AWBI's work before opening up to questions. We have our impact is made through these community wealth building strategies that I've shared. And using these strategies, AWBI has stayed grounded and proximate to community and positioned not only we were positioned to respond rapidly to COVID and the impact that it had on our communities. We convened parties and groups that were necessary to reach the maximum number of people and to get resources out amid COVID and the recent and the awakening that followed the murder of George Floyd. We've also awarded roughly $1.8 million in grants and loans, technical assistance, and programmatic support. We've supported about 80 Black-owned small businesses. We also have awarded roughly 40 nonprofit business support organization grants, preserved more than 300 jobs at Black-owned businesses, and we helped direct about $6.8 million in additional private funding to Georgia's Black-owned businesses and nonprofit business support organizations. Quickly in doing this work, we recently, earlier this year, launched a 1,000 Black Businesses in 1,000 Days campaign, which Catrice mentioned earlier, which focuses on increasing the number of Black-owned businesses that can hire at least one person and pay them a living wage or pay living wages to to employees that are already employed. We also, with that, there are 3 pillars. I mentioned the procurement pillar, growth and scale pillar, which centers around procurement. It also focuses on workforce at the neighborhood level, introducing neighborhood residents to jobs in their neighborhoods and training them on behalf of those businesses and providing holistic support so that they can keep those jobs. And finally, we focus on retention and anti-displacement of Black-owned businesses. which includes estate planning and business succession planning, as well as introducing worker-owned models as possible exit strategies, because often workers are in the best position to take over the business, but perhaps don't have the capital to create an exit for that current owner. And we also focus on increasing the amount of affordable commercial space available to our businesses. Many of our businesses are not able to grow or age in place, and it will completely change the framework of Atlanta if our Black-owned businesses are not able to grow and thrive and remain in the communities that we currently serve, as well as move into other communities that may be best for their market. Collectively, we have an incredible opportunity today and beyond to come together as individuals, as representatives of corporations, government and community partners, to lift up the specific solutions I shared this evening, to rebuild systems from the groundwater up, to lift up the specific solutions I shared. We also have the ability to use these solutions to address the root causes and systemic racial wealth gaps and address racial wealth gap inequities, to promote shared prosperity and restorative justice for not only this region, but the nation. Some of us with continued dedications, others through bold first steps when we close this evening. The important part is you are here. We are together, and we are gathered here at this event to take the first bold steps to roll up our sleeves, lift our voices, and get to work to close this gap and create a brighter future for businesses and families. I thank you for your leadership. I thank you for your partnership. I thank you for having me today. It has been a pleasure, and we will open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Latricia. We appreciate you and your work with the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. And I like what you said on your first slide, reimagine economic realities. Reimagine and hopefully decrease the wealth gap. You've provided us with some valuable information and knowledge. You know, the saying is knowledge is power. Some of the information we knew, and you have provided us with some shared solutions, and hopefully that has empowered us. The solutions that you have provided us with have empowered us to also help decrease the wealth gap. So we'll move into our Q&A session right now. And the first question is, why do you think Hispanic families have surpassed Black families in growing wealth?
Well, I mean, it really comes down to being Black in this country and the experience of accessing resources and leveraging resources is impacted by the reality of our history and the policies that have impacted our ability to do so. It's also centered on being in position to create collective strategies to support our businesses and to ensure, not just our businesses, but as individuals, to leverage resources collectively to center around this community wealth idea. So that's why we emphasize community wealth building. In other communities, it's more natural. I don't want to say more natural, because for Black communities, that was the case as well. But there has been in some cases, a shift away from ensuring that there is prosperity for all within the community, and lifting others up as we go. And sometimes a shift to a more individualistic and, quite frankly, a more white supremacist nature of how we build wealth. And that's not by happenstance. I actually, before starting to do this work, I thought kind of moving to a more individual nature of building wealth was innate as a human, right? Just kind of focus on survival. But what I've learned is that there have been very well-funded initiatives that focus on getting people to focus less on bringing prosperity for a full community and focusing more on is basically, as long as I am okay, as long as my family is okay, then we're fine. And what that creates is a disjointed effort at demanding what we need to create equitable access to building wealth. Do you have other questions?
There are additional questions. We're just having a slight technical difficulty.
Well, I have some of my own, so I completely understand.
There is one question. One of the attendees asked, do you have a website for supporting Black-owned business funds in regards to this initiative?
Absolutely, and I probably didn't include it long enough, but if you visit www.atlantawealthbuilding.org, you can find information about our work, as well as additional resources and tools that can help individuals and businesses. I will put it in the chat.
Hello. Hi, this is Alexis Bouchel. I hope you can hear me. Awesome. So I posted a question as to how we can market, how do we market our campaign to get the word out about this discrepancy in our wealth gap and how we can make it better. You mentioned earlier how with the Hispanic question that you had, that was mine as well, on how that changes, how it's kind of like they support each other or they support their businesses. I don't see that a lot in our communities, or the value in doing that can improve our community growing as well and thriving. We don't have that thriving session or thriving part rather on let's say the South Side or the East Side of Atlanta. So what sort of campaign or business acumen do you think would help to get the word out about the wealth gap and how we can support, how we should support other businesses to help them succeed?
Yeah, I think there are a few things I would say. First, I love Atlanta and Atlanta loves Atlanta. So sharing that these disparities actually exist is the first step. A lot of people, even people who are living these disparities every day, don't realize that these gaps exist, particularly at the level they do. I mentioned that a child born in poverty in Atlanta has just a 4% chance of escaping poverty in their lifetime. In a city where we have every tool available to return to a reality which kind of beget the kind of name as a Black Mecca. We used to have strategies that were in place that made that so, and over time, and we have research to indicate that this started to shift shortly after or around the time of the Olympics. But we had strategies in place that created and promoted wealth building for individuals and for our businesses, being able to open up opportunities for other Black people and to ensure that our community thrives. I think that in terms of, second thing I would say is that I am, when I get that question about why have other groups surpass Black people and why the disparities exist at a greater extent for Black people in Atlanta. I agree that absolutely campaigns around, buying Black, and we be making conscious decisions to support each other, making conscious decisions to lift up our community overall. We did not get here because we failed to support each other. We got here because there is a history of policies and structural racism that has impacted, either directly or more subtly, our ability to grow wealth in a way that can be leveraged to then build more wealth. And that is what has created this gap. And we will not be able to support ourselves out of it if these systems don't shift. And if systems don't shift in a way, quite frankly, to create equitable pathways, which requires a deeper investment in Black communities than other communities, because otherwise a general kind of equal approach to it is only going to continue to widen the gap as other groups continue to strengthen their wealth position, while Black people are just steadily trying to catch up or maintaining still the same gap, but at a larger increase. So I think but that said, I think it is important to support daily in your decisions personally, but as well as promoting support for our businesses and engagement in our systems that support both our businesses and families.
I have another question leading into, I apologize, Tamara. So that sounds like there could be some political ramifications about how that's done. You mentioned earlier about how the noise along the Interstate 20 is different. The noise, what is it? I forget the word they use for it, is
environmental pollution.
Exactly, thank you. Is different from what you see along 75 and 85 north of Atlanta. You don't have the same sort of barriers that keep the noise level down, but yet it adds to any frustration that you might have if you live in that area. However, recently been in that area, there's a lot of regentrification there. So my thoughts are that might change in the years to come if there's enough noise and political interest in getting those things change for the people who now are a part of that community. Just an observation.
No, and you make an excellent point in that. Another thing that we can do is understanding our collective power and making demands. Other communities do that, and which was, why in that scenario, as a community continues to gentrify in those areas, there'll be more noise made. There'll be more demands made on shifts in zoning and transportation requirements and other policies that have not been created for our Black residents. But what last year taught us is if collectively we decide that this is what we're going to demand, we literally have the ability to change the world. The last election, Atlanta showed up as an important factor in ripple effect that literally changed the course of politics internationally. We have to understand and continue to leverage that power. And they're different states. So there's our economic power, and often with strong economic power, you can make demands, greater demands for political shifts. But without that, even we can make demands for political shifts and leverage our political power. We can leverage our voices, and we can leverage who we engage with to bring about the shifts that we need to create healthy environments for ourselves.
And basically, we have to recognize our power. Like you're saying, recognize our power. And that kind of leads into the next question. You talked about getting to the root of the problem and finding solutions. So the next question asks, do you think adding wealth management classes in schools would be valuable? That way we would get to the next generation and we would start to create that power base, with our younger kids. What do you think about that question?
Absolutely. I think that focusing, I think when I was in school, I think it was ninth grade, there was a focus on civics. I think along with civics, there needs to be, first of all, we need to revisit that. It seems that has not been the priority that it should continue to be, so that we can all be actively engaged in our political system. But also, at the same time, introducing at young ages financial literacy tools, basic education around entrepreneurship, and other models around wealth building would be critical to helping ensure that we are positioned to build some wealth. But I'll always emphasize that that is a shift that we can certainly support, but it will only get us so far until some of these broader systems are shifted, so that the barriers to us really building the level of wealth that we should be able to based on our excellence are removed.
Okay. The next question asks, at the grassroots level, what suggestions would you make for each of us as individuals in terms of helping to close the gap?
At the grassroots level, supporting organizations that are in community, either with your time or your financial support, is critical. And those organizations can range from established or informal community engagement organizations, your local churches, your sorority, supporting these kinds of efforts to raise awareness, to get engaged, to make demands, to organize, so that your voice is heard and lifted, and to encourage others to do the same.
Okay. Now, what do you think of the newly established, quote unquote, Black Wall Street location?
I love it. It's I love that whole development, because with it, it's certainly the space for retail space for businesses, but there's also an opportunity to provide space for people to actually live there at affordable rates. And often, starting a business is hard, right? And maintaining a business is expensive. And in Atlanta, it's becoming increasingly difficult to afford to live here. So when you are leveraging all your assets to build a thriving company, it's really helpful to have that access to those sorts of housing and commercial space resources.
Okay. And I know at the top, we did have some people that joined late, and you mentioned some of the root causes of the inequities. And could you kind of briefly go over those again, some of the root causes?
So are you referring to the
for the inequities that cause the inequities?
Well, it's not, some of the root causes again are centered around the root causes are centered across all systems. And from our perspective, those causes are centered around the impact of structural racism in the historical and current day policies that have impacted that. And those policies range from how much our school systems, depending on where they're located, receive. So for example, we, fund each school district based on the tax dollar basis in that community. However, to create an equitable environment, given the impact that these policies have had on Black people's ability to create wealth, that they then can leverage to build wealth and to hold assets like housing, we have to introduce policies that fund the schools at a level where they need to be to create an equitable environment versus basing it purely on kind of the tax base of that. So there are a lot of examples. So it's not just one. I don't think I'm just trying to remember what I share, but it's not really just one root cause. There are historical causes. There are policies around, I'll give you another example, because we often talk about kind of the intersectionality of wealth in the criminal justice system. If you are falsely arrested for driving while Black, for example, and you're arrested on a Friday night and you're in jail until you're arraigned on Monday morning, which then impacts your ability to go to work, which could then impact your ability to keep that job. That is a structural issue that impacts that person's ability to grow wealth in the way that we describe, is particularly in the broader sense. It also, if you start talking about the cost of bail, the cost of hiring a good attorney, all those things factor into ability to ultimately be free in this country. And when we talk about wealth, that's what we want to emphasize, that it's more than just financial assets. It's more than it's not income. It really is this ability to make choices and have a sense of agency for yourself and your family, and have a sense of control over and control to make decisions that impact yourself and your family and your community overall.
And we hear this statement, generational wealth, and that's not something we see a lot of in our community, passing on wealth down to, to our children, our children's children. And that's something that's lacking in our community. What would you say to that? How would you speak about that generational wealth and to empower us so that we can begin to move in that direction?
No, this is so I'm a former estate planning and business succession planning. So I did estate planning, asset protection, and nonprofit law many moons ago. And my purpose is to help people create economic security and sustainable generational wealth. And I'm blessed to be able to do that every day. What I know from practicing is a lot of it is planning. And that's the case for people who have modest assets to people who own $2 billion companies. And I've had the pleasure of serving both ends of the spectrum. We have to protect our assets, be intentional about how we pass them on, help ensure that our families are not left to discern what your intent would be, because ultimately that becomes costly. Or the assets go or distributed in a way that don't allow for continued growth and building of those assets. And it's more popular to say now, but when I started practicing, it wasn't, but people talk about kind of don't sell grandma's house, right? So in a perfect example of not doing that, particularly in Atlanta, but a perfect example of that is, you may never want that house, but your child becomes a college student in that area, and instead of paying rent to someone else, can stay in a home that you can then have roommates that they're paying you rent. That's ability for that college student to build on an asset that was within their family, and to cover some of the costs related to that, which then allows them not to have to spend, once they graduate, not to have to spend their money on trying to find new housing. We can build on that so they can save and use those their burgeoning wealth building activity to grow the wealth of your family overall.
Yes. And a question asked that kind of goes along with that. What lessons should Black communities take away from other groups who are wealthy? Some of the lessons that we can take away.
So there are some tools that I would love to see more of that I think we can support. There, again, during the recent awakening, I think it's become a little bit more popular, but in African cultures, they have something called a susu, which is a pool of money that the community supports, and it is a revolving pool of money that goes to a business in order for them to launch or grow or scale or whatever it might be. And then that business then puts those assets back into that pool for the next business to benefit from it. And I think that growing, we actually have a community loan fund that is built upon those principles. Jewish Americans have a similar tool, and I don't want to get the name wrong, I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment, but they have a similar tool in their community where there's a pool of capital that's available to help businesses grow or get established. So I think we could do that in addition to, we do investment. I think we're doing well with kind of creating investment clubs and those sorts of things, but just pure capital that is given with a kind of no interest loan spirit to it, to allow that business to use that capital to then invest in growing and scaling, which creates more jobs and other opportunities, but they have a responsibility to pay that back into the pool to support more businesses. Other things that I think we can do, I mentioned kind of the Buy Black campaign. I think it includes, and people talk about a Buy Black campaign, but as an organization that specifically is very intentional about only working with Black-owned businesses as our vendors. I think what I also would love to see is, I think with the recent awakening, I'll just put it this way. The reality is that historically, it has not been advantageous for a Black-owned business to say they're Black-owned. Mm-hmm. And some people have chosen to not disclose that because they're concerned about not getting all the opportunities that they otherwise may be able to get, whether right or wrong. But what it does is make it increasingly hard for people to determine if it's a Black-owned business, if they're going to be intentional about it, which then causes people to have to use kind of word of mouth, their personal network to support Black-owned businesses. And that can become frustrating for people who are intending to do that and to support that effort. So I think in addition to support, I think for those of you who are business owners or know other business owners, I think it's important, just people in the community, important to encourage people to share that information so we can be intentional about supporting them.
Okay, there are two questions that go along with housing, the housing crisis in Atlanta. How does the current housing crisis in Atlanta impact the wealth gap here? Also, what resources or suggestions might you have for first-time homeowners who are lower working class or otherwise socioeconomically disadvantaged? And another question that kind of aligns with that is, are Atlanta investors and builders beginning to contribute more to the closing of this gap, or is it trending the other way?
Okay, so I'm going to really have to run.
That's a lot to unpack, I know.
So for the first question, I believe you mentioned around, I'm sorry, you'll have to get it to me again.
Yeah, the housing crisis. How does it impact the wealth gap in Atlanta? And yes. This is a first-time home buyer who has that question.
Mm-hmm. So for that question, absolutely. I was on a call yesterday with an economist for the Metro Atlanta Chamber, and shared that Atlanta, we really are in need of more rental housing being built. And if you think about it, with kind of the growing cost of tuition for college students and others, and just the growing cost of living here in general, and also Atlanta is right now currently has the lowest unemployment rate in the nation. So all those things combined, housing is in high demand because people are moving here. People are not transitioning or transient from this community. There's a certain level of stability. And when you talk about, most people have to rent until they can buy, right? And if those rental costs are beginning to look like mortgage payments, then it is very difficult to save and have the capital that you need, again, unless there is wealth that can be leveraged to do that. And we already talked about that a little bit today, which delays your ability to move into housing. The housing market also is quite expensive here compared. I believe the statistic is that the cost of rental units here have gone up 43% in the last 3 years. That is a fundamental change in who can afford to live in Atlanta. So I think that housing, just like other systems, is directly connected to the ability to build wealth. It certainly can create a great opportunity. Again, if you're in neighborhoods where you have the investment in that community to ensure that your property values continue to grow. And we should have that in all communities, regardless of the makeup of that community, but it is related.
I have a few more questions, but I know it's time for us to wrap up. So I
do want to get to the other two in this category, but okay.
Okay. Did you say you could get to the other?
Yeah.
Okay. Now this one was interesting because so many of us here are not from Atlanta, and we're from other places. So this person asked, when it comes to Atlanta, the overall perception from other areas seems to be that African Americans thrive here. And that's why everybody wants to come to Atlanta. People always want to come. Oh, you live in Atlanta? Oh, I want to come visit you. And this person is from the DC area, moved here a few years ago. And to hear the statistics that you're saying, this viewer is saying is kind of shocking. So do you think that the narrative that Atlanta is a hub for Black excellence somewhat shields the knowledge of just how huge the gap actually is here?
Absolutely. So I moved here from DC myself 10, 11 years ago, even though I went to school here for undergrad. And the city has shifted so much in that time. But what was so stark for me when I moved back here from DC, which is very, an expensive environment, is the increasing rise in costs. And so going back to the narrative, and I'll be quick so we can answer the questions. Going to the narrative issue, or not issue, of how we got this narrative, there were policies put into place by Mayor Maynard Jackson that were intentional about community wealth building. And from that, there were opportunities made available for good jobs for Black people, for our businesses to thrive and grow, and ultimately our Black communities, benefited from those policies. I was talking to Representative Quazza Hall earlier this year, and he was sharing that he benefited from a program at the time where there was transport. You could pick any, he went to Mays, which had a kind of science and math framework, and was directly attributed that to his ability to then go on to MIT. Others you could go to Farrell, you could go to schools that were just public schools, and somehow the teachers had resources to be able to create excellent education opportunities without it being a charter, without it being a private school, and they created those opportunities regardless of socioeconomic background of those students. And at some point, there was a shift in supporting those kinds of policies. And again, we've in the research, shifts started to happen around the Olympics. There were whole communities of businesses that were displaced to make room for various structures for the Olympics, which then shifted the framework and stability of certain communities. All this goes back to policies that impact our Black communities and our ability to build wealth.
And that kind of segues into actually our last question, which is, what should the government's role be in reducing the wealth gap?
So there are really intentional policies that can be put in place around, and we see a lot of it happening, quite frankly, with the Biden Harris administration, where there is significant investment being made specifically to the Black community. And it requires that level of outsized investment, again, to offset years, decades of, centuries of disinvestment in Black people's ability to create a equitable, pathways for Black people. So continuing those policies around supporting our businesses, supporting housing, supporting education in our communities, other kind of policies with government around inclusionary zoning, where certain requirements are made when businesses are move into communities to ensure that there's hiring within that community, that the community's needs are not only heard, but are addressed, and and programs are created to support that, and standing behind it, not just creating the policy, but enforcing it and creating a system of accountability to ensure they move forward. There are other things around kind of creating, it's a range. We talk about, we have this community practice, and one of the things that we create in our policy and practice as a recommendation for newly elected officials this year is, creating a framework statewide, for example, for a state level child tax, dependent care tax credit, which can be meaningful in an environment, particularly when people have had to make hard choices to support family members, whether children or elderly family members, that then impacts their ability in their income to then begin to develop wealth. So there is a broad range of things that can happen.
Okay, thank you. I think we've answered all of the questions that was put into the Q&A. If there's one thing that you could give us to just take away, what would be that one statement that you would make?
I would say to be mindful, be active, be loud, in sharing the fact that these disparities are real. These are facts. They're not up for debate. Then it's really positioning it so people can make a decision about what they want to do about it. And if we collectively can continue to raise awareness around these issues like you all have done this evening. And then, quite frankly, I know there are some bad women on this call who sit at desks every day and have the ability to make choices and decisions. I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to take into consideration the fact that these disparities are really real, and to leverage your own personal power in whatever way you can as a volunteer, as an employee, as a decision maker, to begin to create, do your own work to create pathways to shared prosperity.
Thank you so much for your answers. And we all want to, as you said, reimagine.
Yes.
Now turning over to Joy McLeod. She is the chair of our Economic Development Committee, and she will close us out.
Latricia, we thank you for your insightful presentation and responses, and thank you for even getting in those last questions. In closing, we want to share that we have 2 upcoming webinars in January. The first is maximizing your streams of income. We have Ayani Hughes and Tamika Bullitt as our speakers. The second is making moves with investments and wills, which is what Latricia was just talking about in her responses. And our speakers are Camila Elliott and Valentia Aline. So please be on the lookout on Eventbrite, Instagram, and Facebook to register for these webinars. And with that, we thank you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening.